Well, I won't be half as entertaining as Kerry just was. But the good bit is that I'll be followed by Geoffrey Blainey. So, as you know, we run 3 or 4 of these sessions during the year, and we try to get a very prominent speaker for you for these evenings. And that's certainly the case this evening, as illustrated by the number of people who have come. And I think the number of people who are here illustrates that you know Geoffrey Blainey and you've come along to meet him and to see him, to listen to him. So that tells me that I really do not have to introduce him to you, because I think he's very well known to you all. But nevertheless, I think I should remind you of some of his accomplishments. Professor Geoffrey Blainey, AC, has held chairs of economic history and plain history at the University of Melbourne for 21 years. He was a delegate to the 1998 Constitutional Convention in Canberra. He's chaired various Commonwealth bodies, including Australia Council, Literature Board, Australia-China Council, and the National Council for the Centenary Federation, as many more, I suspect as well. He is one of the few Australians whose biography appears in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and he's written some 36 full-length books, and I guess, as we all know, they are not novels, but works which require extensive research and hard work to generate. Tyranny of Distance, Triumph of the Nomads, Black Kettle, Full Moon, Short History of the 20th Century, Short History of Christianity, and a more recent Short History of the World, to name just a few. And the Short History of the World is, I think, the theme for this evening, where Geoffrey will be talking to us about the writing of that book. So I hope I've got that correct, Geoffrey. So please welcome Geoffrey to the rostrum.
Mr. Chairman, members, honoured guests, is everybody here? In every corner? Thank you very much for the generous introduction. You said I didn't write novels, as some of my critics say I do. I wasn't sure what to speak about tonight, but I gave several suggestions to your CEO, and this was the one writing the history of the world, which they thought would be suitable. I shouldn't have offered it to them because I haven't spoken on the subject before, and I had to read parts of the book to see what I said. I'm glad the sign is gone. I don't own a PowerPoint. It's terrible these days if you go to a gathering and they say, "Where's your PowerPoint?" You feel like a footballer who hasn't brought his football. I had a great desire to, for some years, I don't know where it came from, to write a history of the world. I thought I tried to read several published histories of the world, and they didn't particularly excite me, not because they weren't good, but because you like some books and you don't like others. I also had the idea that we expect students that when we teach history to study a year of Roman history and half a year of the history of Queensland and half a year on Europe in the Renaissance, and we expect them to put it all together. But we who teach them don't have to put it all together. And I thought I should make an attempt to put the history of the world all together and write it in a way that it would at least interest me. And that became my ambition. In a sense, I read the book for myself, but that's quite legitimate. If you like it, you know that 2 or 3 other people will also enjoy it. I thought I should see places I hadn't seen, and sometimes I lecture in ships. Many of the cruise ships have lecturers, and so if I was offered a cruise to an exotic place, I accepted it. And I increased, if you go to a place your interest is stimulated enormously, isn't it? You may go with little knowledge, but suddenly you find yourself working hard to acquire the knowledge you wished you had when you visited the place. And I remember going to Zanzibar, about which I knew nothing, but I soon learned things, and I went to Burma, to a great variety of places, learning, of course, from all of them. And then I thought, when I get a break, I would try to write the history of the world. I set aside 2 years or 2.5 years to do the research. I don't employ research assistants. I have to do the research myself, and while I did a few other things at the time, this was my main task for 2.5 years. I started it in the late 1990s, and I probably gave it 40 to 50 hours each week, and sometimes maybe 60 hours each week. Of course, some of the most interesting subjects were those about which I knew little, but that's the way it is. When I resolved to write it, I thought I must ration it. The big tendency is if you write the history of anything, you find yourself more interested in the first part of it. The very early days seem to attract you for some reason, and if you're not careful, you devote half the book to the very early period, and you haven't got adequate space for the periods that come afterwards. And after I'd done a fair bit of the research, I made a map, and I resolved that every part of the history, which I could then see in my mind's eye, would have a certain number of words. For the Renaissance or the Reformation, I might have said 5,500. It's quite easy to count words, isn't it, now with the word processors? At one time, you just had to count them faithfully, one by one. And I thought, for that great event in the world's history, the invention of agriculture, which happened about 10,000 years ago, mainly in the Middle East, but probably about that time in other parts of the world too, I resolved that I would have 10,000 words and so forth. I stuck to it by and large, and when I was writing a section and I reached my word limit, I went back and eliminated words so that I would still have enough words to devote to that section. Some of my best writing is vanished, I was sad to say. If you're new to a computer, you can never recall some of the most interesting things. I had it in my head that you can't say too much. You have to decide whether you're writing a mini encyclopedia or a Guinness Book of Records, the kinds of things that people will look up. Or you're writing a book that will say the main things you'd want to say, and that people will still be interested as they continue on. And I thought I would have, like some of you go to the cricket, I would have sections that were fast bowling, where you go for your life and you try to fill in as many important facts or attitudes or ways of life as you can. And then I'd have periods when I slowed the story down and made it almost static so that you could devote attention to perhaps how people lived in a certain era at a point of time, and then go on with the story. I stuck to that quite religiously, and often I wrote the slow bowling parts within my allotted word quota before I wrote the fast bowling parts. I thought it's so important that you slow the story down. Of course, when you're slowing the story down, you've got more chance to build up atmosphere, to explain everyday life, and the things that often readers are interested in. I looked today to see part of slow bowling I could read out. The parts I thought were good, they're not so good. They're a bit too slow. But this is a bit of slow bowling. This is curious. Now I read a longer book, and Penguin, the publisher, called it a short history of the world. I said the short was quite long. It's about, it was about 700 pages, and then when foreign publishers were interested in a translation, translation by a good translator is very expensive, and a foreign publisher wanting to translate a book and taking the risk would like the book to be shorter. So they said, "Can you cut the book in half?" Which I did. I did it down to 55%, and they became a great problem. What do you call them? Half book. I said to the publisher, "Well, this is your fault. You've got to answer this." But they said, "No, you do it." And I said, "It's called a very short history." It's it's about 500 pages. The page is not quite so large. I did it in a week, quite ruthlessly. I thought I wouldn't trust it to anybody else, and I think actually this is the better. This is the better book. It's got the right mix of fast bowling and slow bowling, and so it pleases me very much. And this is sold, of course, much more than the short history of the world, which many people think is not short enough. But that's by the by. Here's an example of what I mean by slow bowling. One of the curious things, it's elementary, but occasionally when you think about a subject, you see things that are so obvious that hardly anybody has noticed them before. They're so obvious, so elementary. We all know examples of this. It may be what I'm writing about has been written about before, but I don't know who's done it. But somebody possibly has. Here it is. For most of human history, the contrast between day and night was as acute as the contrast between summer and winter. Darkness kept people inside their cave, their bark shelter, their hut, or their farmhouse. Fear of wild animals was also an incentive to stay inside or near the protective light of a blazing fire. Night was linked to the sinister. The devil was said to conduct orgies during the night. Witches rode on their broomsticks in the night time. We all know that because we were told so as infants. At least two of the major religions saw night as a time when, in the silence and darkness, God might speak to them in a way he might not speak given the daylight. Muhammad received much of the Quran from on high, late one night, so he said. Early Christians saw virtue in praying in the night because then they could pray in silence. Many expected Christ to return at the hour of midnight. I'll just leave out a bit of the slow bowling because so it doesn't get out of hand. During the 19th century, this is still the slow bowling section. During the 19th century, an extraordinary change reached some cities in Europe, Australia, North America and Asia. The night ceased to contrast sharply with the day. Inside a house, for the first time in history, the artificial light at night was often clearer than the natural light at day, thanks to the abundance of whale oil, which was used for lamps. It made a first-class lighting lamp. The new kerosene extracted from underground oil fields. Of course, the early oil fields produced kerosene rather than petroleum. Thanks also to the invention of gas and electricity. So many daytime activities could, if necessary, be continued during the early hours of the night. Moreover, by 1900, the streets of large cities were lit by electricity and knitted together by trams and trains, and so people could travel some distance to pursue social activities in the evening. Before then, if you wanted a night function, unless it was in the heart of the city, you had it on a moonlit night. And if you go through the early advertisements for events in Australia, perhaps a Masonic meeting, perhaps a dance, perhaps a visiting politician, it would often say at the bottom, full moon, to reassure people that they would get home safely. Now we think full moon was the name of the band. Just one other sentence. The blurring of night and day was aided in an unexpected way by new electronic communications. They provided instant contact, and so somebody experiencing daylight could talk to somebody who far away was already in the night. Of course, it was the great Italian engineer Marconi who made this invention. And so, we're in the strange situation now. We can see an event on the far side of the world when we're in the night time and they're in the daytime. But in so many ways, the distinction between night and day, partly in our own lifetime, has become clear. That's the kind of thing I call snowballing. I didn't have a set message when I wrote the book. Some people say you should have a theme. I didn't have a theme. I thought the theme will emerge as I wrote, and I didn't have a special message to give to the reader. I suppose each reader takes from the book what she or he is prepared to take or wants to take. some of the messages in the book are, I suppose, how unexpected things are in history. If you're a historian, you know what's happened, and somehow they seem preordained. But of course, if you live in the present and you're looking into the future, you know that events are very difficult to predict in advance. And one of the things I think we should learn from history, how powerful is the unexpected. I have the view, by the way, I'm not sure if I said this in the book, I have the view now that the future is more difficult to predict, this is my view, than it was 100 years ago. The future is now more difficult to predict than it was 100 years ago. You know, just as a simple example, if in 1960 we brought together all the bright people of Australia, all the bright people of the world, and we said, tell us, it's now 1960. Can everyone hear? Am I between the microphone? If somebody asked all these bright people in 1960, tell us about the next decade, it would be interesting to know if there are 100 bright people in the world, whether one in 100 said, look, by the end of the decade we will have the counterculture. We will have the new wave of feminism, the new interest in nature, and all those other things that are associated very much with the counterculture. It really is an astonishing. With it, of course, has gone a very different attitude to music, and a high proportion of the young today wouldn't dream of going to a symphony concert, would they? Whereas a considerable proportion of the young in 1920, if they wanted to better themselves, would go to a symphony concert. If we asked them in 1970, what's going to happen? You haven't been too bright. Who would have predicted in 1970 that in the 1970s, at a time when economics seemed to be triumphing, was probably the most advanced of the social sciences, who would have predicted that the world was about to enter the most inflationary decade since the Napoleonic Wars? And that inflation, of course, was accompanied, they used the name, didn't they, stagflation. You not only had inflation, but you had a lack of growth of employment. If you brought them all together, and I'll just end with the 1980s, but I could go on. If you brought all these people together and said, you haven't had much luck, what about some research assistants? We'll give you a year to do the research. And he said, what's going to happen in the 1980s? It would be interesting, maybe one, or maybe even two would have said, by the end of that decade, the Cold War will be over. Communism will be in disarray, even questioned in China, and the world entering some kind of a new era. Now, I picked out examples that are favourable to my point of view, but I could pick out plenty of other examples. I'm not saying that there are not various things that people didn't predict. They did predict all kinds of things. But just think of those powerful events that happened, which were very difficult to foresee even 5 or 10 years before those events descended upon the world. It makes you conscious, doesn't it, of the role of the unexpected. And I think when you're writing history, you should try often to put yourselves in the boots of the people living at the time, rather than sitting on a high mountain and seeing how the events unfolded. To write history too much in retrospect is dangerous. So if another message in the book maybe is the power of technology. I think in the last 300 or 400 years, technology has possibly done more than anything to shape the world. It's contributed so much to the rise of prosperity, to so many other things. I think we're in an unusually materialist age, where possibly, I don't think I said this in the book because I haven't fully realised it, maybe I hinted at it, we're probably in the most materialist age in history. We've lived through a remarkable period, and the older ones here, including me, have seen astonishing changes in the material well-being of large sections of the people in at least half the world, maybe 2/3 of the world. You know, you go back to Australia, just taking Australia in 1940, and we were one of the most prosperous countries in the world. In Australia in 1940, the average household, the majority of households didn't have a telephone. The majority of households in Australia didn't have a motor car. A lot had a refrigerator, but the majority didn't have a refrigerator. They had a cool guardie safe, and in summer an ice safe. The ice delivered by the woodman who had nothing to do in the summer. You know, you can all remember how we had, unless you went away to war, the hope of we're comfortably off Australia in 1940 or 1930. If ever travelling overseas was small, wasn't it? If you lived in Melbourne, the wish of your life, if you were a person of reasonable means, was to go to Sydney. And you planned for a couple of years, and you booked the hotels there. When people came back, they constantly knocked at the door, and did you find the people in Sydney? The world has changed materially, hasn't it? It makes me think that the material changes are so unexpected, so powerful. Understandably, we are materialists, but I think a lot of wisdom comes to us from the distant past, and I think there's great truth in that saying. I'm not sure whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Man or mankind cannot live by bread alone, and I suspect that's the truth, and ultimately it will be rediscovered. But understandably, we're unquestionably all those numbers of materialists. Could I just say something about working methods? I read my first book my first book was published by Melbourne University Press in 1954. There weren't many books published in Australia in those days. An enormous number of books on Australian history are published each year, but then there were very few, and any book, because there were so few, any book published on Australian history was reviewed in all the major newspapers. You can write a very good book today, and not one major newspaper would review it. So much is coming out. So you were so fortunate to be writing in that period. There were great disadvantages, of course. But my first book I wrote with a fountain pen. If you were smart, you had a fountain pen. No borrowers then, I assume. And I wrote with a fountain pen and crossed out. And because typing was expensive, I tried to do only one draft of anything I wrote. Occasionally you failed, but it was important to be succinct, because you paid a typist, or if you couldn't pay a typist, perhaps a relative would do the typing. Well, Peter Isaacson, you know what? Typing was a female profession, wasn't it? Surprisingly few men could type, and now all around the world, men are taking to this once feminine task. And so I learned to write. If retyping was expensive, it was most important that you had the book in your head before you wrote. You knew the sequence, what was in chapter 1, what was in chapter 2, and you stuck to the sequence. I think I've suffered greatly. I learned to type. I think my fourth book I typed poorly, but I typed. And eventually the electric typewriter came in, and I learned how to use the electric typewriter, a great invention, because your typing suddenly becomes even, doesn't it? Previously it's uneven on the page. And then when somebody interviewed me in the newspaper, and I said, well, I don't have a computer. Somebody rang up from a big business and said they were throwing out all their computers because a new model was coming in. And would you like one? I said, no. My wife had overheard me and said, you must take it. It was one of these heavy things of the mid-1980s, so I moved to the computer. I think I have in my, I can use the computer and I know all this thing. I think cut and paste is a terrible trap. It's a most astonishing invention, cut and paste. You can unravel, you can realise you hadn't made up your mind and change it. It really is a wonderful thing. I think if you're writing, if you're writing history or anything which has to be narrative, cut and paste. It's a terrible trap. It's a terrible trap because writing, if you've ever thought about it, and some of you have, writing is an Indian file technique. The words go through a mountain pass one at a time. They can only go through one at a time, and sequence is all important. If we had 5 actors suddenly jump on here, come running in here, and say, now it's our turn, and they put on a little play, things can happen simultaneously on the stage, can't they? 2 things, you can be watching one actor who's giving one message and another person who's doing something and giving another message. The same with television. And I think since writing is an Indian file technique, sequence is all important, and you have to early. If you don't do it, you cut and paste, what do you do at the joins? And you've got things that are great, but there's nowhere to fit them, but you don't want to lose them. You've had great trouble writing. So I have to say that this wonderful technological invention, I haven't really mastered it, and I wish it hadn't been invented. So I wrote this book. It was published in the year 2000. every book you write, I think if you're serious, I'm serious as a writer. I try to do my best. Everything you write, you think, well, it's as good as I can do. Sometimes you've got a deadline, and you think, well, if I had more time, I might have done more research or cut back a chapter in a book. But you know, usually you do something and you think, well, it's as good as I can do, you know, given the abilities and defects we all have. And so that book was as good as I could do. Inevitably, history is a very difficult task to write. There are all kinds of things you can't know. There's no evidence for them. Sometimes you can know, but the evidence is not available or you haven't heard of it. There are new interpretations that come in and you realise the advantages of them. There are new topics which suddenly excite interest and you realise that topic has got a great history going back in time and you should have cut that. But, and of course, soon after you publish a book, it's still interesting publishing a book. You get letters from, you know, all kinds of older people still write letters. They've got more time to write letters than they ever had before, and that's great receiving letters from people saying that they appreciated the book or that they didn't. Sometimes they don't, but usually it's only it's some facts that they found out wrong, and when the book has a new edition, you can correct them. It was very hard to correct errors in books in the past. Now it's quite easy with the new techniques of printing. All kinds of little things. And when I was travelling a lot, I went to India. I hadn't been to India before, and I went to Cochin. Have you ever been to Cochin on the west coast? It's got a very ancient synagogue, which may have had links, you know, in pre-medieval times with Europe. It's got also Vasco da Gama died there, and eventually his body was taken back to Portugal, one of the great discoverers in the history of the world. I went to the cathedral and somebody told me in the aisle where Vasco da Gama was buried, and I put it in my head, or I suppose I put it in a notebook, and when I was writing about Vasco da Gama, I said he was buried in the cathedral in Cochin on the west coast of India. Somebody immediately writes in and says it's not a cathedral. It was, but it's now a parish church. Fair enough. you have to fit those global warming, of course, is a very difficult subject for anybody writing history, but historians are entitled to a point of view. To me, and there are people here with strong views on either side, it's one of the most fascinating intellectual topics I've ever heard about global warming. The most interesting part is if there is global warming, what's caused it. Is it, you know, our bad behaviour as human beings in industrial civilization, or is it something that has come more out of the cyclical in nature? You know, I don't know the answer. I'd love to be alive in 200 years' time to know just what happens, whether it has adverse effects, whether it has seriously adverse effects, whether we can turn them back. What's the ultimate answer on the cause? How would you? and people, of course, if you don't write about global warming in the way they like, that's what they pick up at the moment. And fair enough. My view is that the meteorologists, the specialist meteorologists, they inhabit that world. I think meteorology is still a semi-speculative science. Meteorologists might say, how dare you, but I think compared to many sciences, it's still semi-speculative. When they first started giving lectures on global warming, which I attended, I would sometimes ask them about 1990, how do you explain the period of global warming that happened 15,000 years ago? There was an astonishing period of global warming that resulted in the separation of Australia from New Guinea and from Australia from Tasmania in Aboriginal times. It's well over half time in human history. And I would say to them, what's your explanation for that? It puzzled me slightly that if you're making generalisations, you haven't got a ready explanation. Really, I'm not saying I know what the answer is, but that puzzled me. And understandably, since I believe that Greenland did have a period of great warming, and that the medieval world was a period of great warming. Whether it was as strong in the southern hemisphere, we can't be sure. And people write to you and say, surely Greenland didn't have a period of global warming. The evidence is unmistakable between about 800 AD and 1400 AD. The Greenland was eventually abandoned climate became dictated. No, that's the kind of question that people understandably will write to you. You can't end into full arguments. All you can do is say, well, it's an open question. I have to report that there was a period of global warming with profound effects on the world. It's the greatest event, I think, in the human history of Australia, that earlier period of global warming, about 15,000 years ago, when the map of Australia was completely altered. There can be no event in the human history of Australia as powerful as that. All you can say is, it's an open question. This is what the evidence says for me. But people more and more write on that tantalising subject. I must leave time for questions and for discussion. The book, incidentally, has been, to my surprise, has been very, very successful. It's been translated into many languages, and you don't know why a book takes off or why a book doesn't. You hope everything you write takes off, but usually they don't. But this book has taken off in a surprising way, and it was on the bestseller list in Brazil, non-fiction bestseller list, I think, for 140 weeks in a row. I didn't hear about it until the 140 weeks were almost over. They're very, but that's what happens in the world. That is not quite as fast as we think it is. I've just brought out a new edition. There are three things which I probably should have mentioned, which I didn't. By 2000, when I finished the book, the computer revolution was well advanced. If I mentioned it, it's only in passing. I've written a new section on whatever name you want to give it. There's astonishing change in information technology and so forth. That should have been in the early book, and it wasn't, and I put that in. So, I mean, that's a clear failing. Islam wasn't so militant when I wrote the book. The book was published 3 weeks after September the 11th, 2000. So that showed up that I gave Islam rather too good a deal in modern times, and I've tried to remedy that. And there are other things which should have been in this. I had the view, and I carried it too far. I thought, if you're writing a history of the world, you must be careful not to give too much space to the last 100 years. If you're writing a history of the world, you must not give too much space to the time in which you lived. You know, we all think that our era is enormously important, and it is. But there's no point in writing a history of the world unless you try to assess the role of much earlier civilization. You see, at the moment, while the computer revolution is transforming the world, it's too early to judge, isn't it, how it will change the world compared to other revolutions. My belief is that the invention of agriculture was a more important revolution so far than the computer revolution. When you think of the way of life the Aborigines lived, an ingenious way of life, and often a very intelligent way of life, with virtually no hoarding of food, a small population moving about using their systematic knowledge of what plants and other foods will be available. That way of life can only support a tiny population. If the whole world today was living the kind of life that the Aborigines lived 10,000 years ago, the world would only have 1% of its present population. The agricultural revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, the hoarding of food, happening about 10,000 years ago, was an astonishing event with profound ramifications. You know, for the first time you could have towns because they could hoard food. You could have specialist people, whether soldiers and so forth, because a smaller proportion of the population was needed to produce the daily food. The domestication of plants and animals is, of course, also the domestication of human beings. It's two-way, isn't it? It's a two-way process. So I don't know the answer to this one. The computer revolution may eventually be seen as the equal of the industrial revolution. I'm not sure if it can be seen as the equal of what they call the Neolithic revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, the beginning of agriculture and herd keeping. But we don't know. The interesting thing about these revolutions, the economic revolutions, is we don't know as much about them as we should. A particular revolution can be going for a long time before you know the direction it will take. The Industrial Revolution, we all learned about it when we went to school or university. And the Industrial Revolution for a long time was associated with spinning jenny, which was a Crompton's wheel and Arkwright's frame. The revolution in the handling of textiles, largely in the north of England, wool and cotton, a revolution that extended to other manufacturing industries. For a long time I thought, and I think most people thought, that the rise of the factory system, that was the essence of the Industrial Revolution. I'm now completely convinced, I could be wrong, that the great thing that came out of the Industrial Revolution wasn't really visible on a large scale, but it was transport on land, the railway, transport on sea, the steamship, then the portable engine, then the internal combustion engine, using petrol rather than coal, then the aircraft, happening in quick succession after the motor car, and then the rocket. That use of new source of energy, especially for transport, I think in terms of world history, that is more transforming than the Industrial Revolution and what happened in manufacturing. And as late as 1880, when the Industrial Revolution, starting in England, had been going for 100 years, it didn't have a generally accepted name. Then they called it the Industrial Revolution, and that's the name we know by. I don't think it's the right name, but there it is. Sometime they will give to the computer revolution and all its ramifications a name. I don't know what the name will be. I don't think it's got a general name at the moment. I don't think it has. And it may have a name that's nothing to do with the name we'd be inclined to give it now. I must conclude. So it's I've written this book. It was a great educational experience for me. It gave me difficulties, and of course it gave me great pleasure because I could see how things happened, or how I thought they happened over a long period of time, and to do that is to give you most pleasure, even if you haven't got it, even if you may not have got it right. And I hope the book will also give pleasure to many people. As long as I live, I'll stick at it and bring it up to date.